in Job 38 through the first little bit of chapter 40. Last week we saw how Elihu has finished his big speeches at Job, and in his speeches he made an effort to draw Job's attention to the greatness of God, rather than having Job focus on his own suffering and the seeming unfairness of it all. Elihu may have been a little bit arrogant in the way he did it sometimes. He may have gotten off track a few times, but he kind of had the right focus, trying to get Job back in the right place. And one of his illustrations for God's greatness as he was speaking was a violent storm. And he may have even been pointing to one off in the distance, because apparently in the Middle East you can see them coming from a long ways away across the desert. And as Elihu gets done speaking, God finally shows up. All this time, Job has been wanting to plead his case before God. He's been saying that he wants to have this conversation with God. He wants to persuade God to justify himself and to persuade God that he shouldn't be suffering like this. Well, he finally gets his chance as God appears in a whirlwind. And the way that Job apparently wanted the conversation to go down was something like this. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "O Job, you speak rightly. Your righteous questioning of my way shall receive an answer. I will explain myself to you, that you may fully understand why I have done this. I have not treated you as you deserve, for Satan incited me against you. Yet because of your integrity I shall desist." Is that what 38 says? Chapter 38? It's just a different... No, it's not a different translation. No, that's not at all what God says to Job. That's obviously what Job is expecting to hear from God, something along those lines. And a lot of people expect Job's story to end about that way. But God said, "Oh, you're right, Job. Here, let me give you all your stuff back." And people might not say so, but they're a bit disappointed with the answer that God does give to Job. Or at least they're very confused by it. Say, I don't see how that connects to what's been happening in the rest of the book. And in fact, it's not uncommon to hear people who dislike Christianity and are trying to argue against Christianity use God's answer to Job as supposed proof that God is mean. As supposed proof that God is not a good God, but he's a cruel God. Well, that's obviously not what's happening at all. But let's go ahead and see what God does say to Job, because it's nothing like what Job was expecting to hear. At least I don't think so. Chapter 38, verses 1 through 3, God kind of introduces his speech. It says, "And the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?'" God's opening words to Job are kind of a rebuke. Elihu has made the same accusation of Job, that he's darkening counsel by words without knowledge. He said it back in chapter 34, verse 35, as well as chapter 35, verse 16. Now God repeats it. God doesn't question Job's integrity. God doesn't question Job's sincerity. In fact, God has already spoken in favor of those two things to Satan back at the start of the book in chapters 1 and 2. Job did pass the test in the most important regard, that he did stay faithful to God. But God questions Job's ignorant attempts to describe what God is doing in the world, what God is doing in his life. He says that Job is darkening counsel. Job's explanations, which have come pretty close to saying that God is treating me unfairly, are obscuring or confusing people's understanding of the way God works in the world. And the reason for this is that Job's explanations are not backed up by sufficient knowledge. Job doesn't know what's going on behind the scenes. Now back in chapters 1 and 2, we got to look behind the scenes as we saw this conversation between God and Satan, in which God allows Satan to do all these horrible things to Job to show that Job really does love and trust him regardless of whether he's being blessed or not. Job doesn't know that, and Job's been coming up with all these explanations, or at least questions that seem to imply that God is unfair. And God isn't actually very happy about that. His opening words to Job are kind of a rebuke. And then God goes on to set the terms of their debate. He said, okay, you want to have this debate? You've been asking for it all these times. Okay, we'll set the terms here. All the way back in chapter 13, in verse 22, Job had said this. He said, speaking to God, he says, "Then call and I will answer, or let me speak, and you reply to me." Job basically said to God, we can do this however you want to. Either you ask me questions and I'll answer you and give an answer for myself, or maybe I can ask questions and you can give an answer for yourself and what you've been doing. Well, we'll do it however you want. Well, verse 3 of chapter 38, God tells Job how this is going to go down. Job 38:3 says, "Dress for action like a man, I will question you, and you make it known to me." God tells Job to brace himself like a man. Brace himself for action, because God is about to ask him some questions. The word used with brace for action has the idea of when men back then, they wore an inner robe and an outer robe, and when you got ready for action, you tucked up the outer robe, which was the longer flowing one, up into your belt so that you'd be ready to run or do hard work or whatever it was without it getting in your way. Kind of rolling up your sleeves. Or, so God basically says, roll up your sleeves or man up or whatever phrase you want to use, because I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. Answer like a man, Job. And over the next two speeches that God makes, he asks a long series of dozens of questions. The commentaries I read, one said there's almost 60, one said there's 77. Different Bibles punctuate differently. So we'll just say a lot of questions. And all these questions that God asks have to do with nature and with the physical universe. And Job is not really able to give a very impressive answer to any of them. And at first glance, they seem to be off topic. Why is God discussing these things with Job? But as we go through the questions, maybe we'll get an idea of why God is taking this path in answering Job. So verses 4 through 7, the first set of questions, chapter 38, 4 through 7 says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." God starts out asking Job, what do you know about the making of the earth? Where were you when that was happening? And God poetically describes the making of the earth as if he's building a house, measuring it, marking out the lines, laying the foundation, setting the cornerstone. And asks Job, so, where were you when that was going on? Surely you know. And another little interesting tidbit here, not the main point, but something interesting, is that he mentions the sons of God shouting for joy at the foundation of the earth. In Job, who are the sons of God? He mentioned it in chapter 1. That's the way God refers to angels in this book. So apparently the angels were created at some point before the earth. And, like I said, that's neither here nor there, a little bit of trivia. But angels first, then the earth. So God asks Job first off, where were you when the earth was made? Obviously, the answer is he wasn't around. God continues. Next topic. Verses 8 through 11. It says, "Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When it made clouds its garments and thick darkness its swaddling band? Prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud ways be stayed." It says, well, who put the limits on the sea, Job? And again, God poetically describes it this time in terms of birth. The sea was given birth, it came rushing out, and he clothed it with clouds and darkness, and he set the boundaries for where it could go. Job, where were you when that was happening? What part did you have in that, Job? And it's interesting, as I said, Job doesn't have any good answers, or at least not any impressive answers to any of these questions. And the questions that God asks, even today, no human being is going to have a very impressive answer to them. Because, do we have any control over the ocean? Over the seas? Well, we might be able to a little bit control rivers and seas and things a little with levees and things like that. But when they go into full flood, or when there's a storm surge, what can we do about it? Like Chuck said, get out of the way. we were all here when the water came rushing through Knoxon. That's just a little river up there. We have no control over even a small river or stream, let alone the ocean being able to set the boundaries of it. God continues, his next topic, verses 12 through 15. He says, "Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken." So, Job, can you cause the cycle of night and day? Have you been doing that ever since you existed? And God describes the cycle of night and day like he's a commanding general who brings up the sun to put an end to the wicked acts that are done by people in the darkness. And Job has talked about that already back in chapter 24. He spent something like 5 verses 14 through 17, complaining about the wicked things that are done in darkness. God says, so Job, can you bring up the sun and make the darkness go away and the wicked people stop doing wicked things? And clearly, again, this is something over which humans have no control. Because what makes the sun come up? Yeah, rotation of the earth. Can we do one little thing to stop the rotation of the earth? No. And if we tried, it would be, and somehow succeeded, that would be a really bad thing, because everything is flung off into space if you stop it fast enough. And yet, God can mess with that cosmic order whenever he wants to. We have two examples in history of him messing with the sun. Don't know who he did it for? Okay, well, there's the creation of the sun for one thing, yeah. But there's a couple times where he makes the sun either stand still or go backwards. No, not that. Yeah, that was a star. The stars will come up in a minute. One time it was with Joshua. Joshua's fighting a battle, and he prays that there be more time to fight the battle, and God makes the sun stand still. And another time, Hezekiah is sick. King Hezekiah. And God says, I'll give you a sign. You want the sundial to go forwards extra or backwards? And Hezekiah says, let's make it go backwards. So God makes the sundial go backwards. How he does without everything getting flung off into space? Yeah, he's God. He can do what he wants. And there have been other times where supernatural darkness has prevailed on the earth. For example, the crucifixion of Jesus. And in the future, in the book of Revelation, there's all kinds of cosmic things that happen with the sun and the moon and the stars. And we as mere human beings, that is something that is completely and totally beyond our control. God continues with his next topic. Verses 16 through 18. It says, have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare it if you know all this. So Job, have you thoroughly explored the earth? That talks about the springs of the seas and the recesses of the deep. Until about the 20th century, no one was quite sure what on earth God was talking about with the springs of the sea. 20th century, they discovered something interesting. I think it was in the 60s. These things called ocean vents. All along, apparently, the northern part of the mid-Atlantic ridge, there's these vents that shoot hot water, along with minerals and so forth, which is why they're kind of black-looking, up into the ocean. God said, so, Joe, have you seen those? And we haven't even seen these until 40 years ago. And God says, so, Joe, have you walked on the bottom of the sea? Anyone know how deep, any guess how deep the deepest part of the ocean is, at least that we've measured? 6.8 miles deep. That's deep enough that if you put the highest mountain, Mount Everest, in it, it would still be covered by a mile of water. It is the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, 36,070 feet deep, so more than 6.8 miles. Has anyone ever walked on that? No. You can't survive that. On all the science behind it, but you can't survive that. They sent down a bathyscaphe submersible that reached almost that far down. It went down to 35,814 feet, so they were still 256 feet above the bottom, which is a pretty significant amount. So, Joe, have you walked to the bottom of the ocean lately? All said to me, you've seen the gates of death. Joe, do you know where dead people go when they die? Do you know the location of Hades? Of heaven? Do we know the location of Hades or heaven? No. God hasn't bothered to reveal that to us. Excuse me, says Job, have you comprehended the size of the earth? Can you wrap your mind around how big the earth is? And I'm guessing Job probably doesn't know. I don't think they had that much scientific knowledge back then. We do have pretty accurate measurements now. Depending on exactly where you measure, it can be about 24,900 miles around. That means it's about 7,900 miles straight through. The surface area of the Earth is 196.9 million square miles. They're numbers that are kind of too big to really picture. And yet, God made it. You know, to God, that's a tiny thing compared to the universe. It goes on. Verses 19 through 21. Oh, I think I'm behind on the slides, aren't I? Oh, no, there we go. 19 through 21. It says, where is the way to the dwelling of light? And where is the place of darkness? that you may take it to its territory, that you may discern the paths to its home. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. I said, so Job, tell me about the light and the darkness. Where's that come from? Even today, scientists still struggle to understand light. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? It's kind of both. Photons. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, some scientists managed to make a photon into a new kind of matter, which they thought was previously impossible. They're still figuring out stuff about light, and still don't have it all nailed down. And God maybe gets a bit, not maybe, God does get a bit sarcastic with Job here. Oh yeah, Job, you know this. You were alive back then. You've been alive a long time. Tell me all about it, Job. Next topic, verses 22 through 30. It says, have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where light is distributed, or whence the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth, and who has given birth to the frost of heaven? The water becomes hard like stone, the face of the deep is frozen. God says, okay, maybe that stuff's too difficult, so Job, just explain the weather to me. And God describes the weather in very poetic terms, in terms of being born. So Job, can you explain the weather? Even today, we might have a little bit better explanation of the weather than Job would have had at his fingertips. But how good is the weatherman at predicting exactly what's going to happen? He's really predicting the weather is just guesswork. Yeah, educated guesswork. He looks at the data that he has on hand, and he looks at a lot of past data to see how the weather has behaved in the past, and he makes an educated guess as to what it's going to do, over the next 5 days. And, any more than 2 or 3 days out, he's really bad at it. Yeah. The weather is a mystery. It's not a predictable force. And God goes on. Verses 31 through 33. It says, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season, or can you guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of the heaven? Can you establish their rule on the earth? So don't recognize what the Pleiades, Orion, the bear, or also called Arcturus, are. Yeah, they're constellations. And also Mazzaroth, we have no idea which one Mazzaroth is. But the Pleiades. This group of stars here, that's taken, I believe, with the Hubble Space Telescope. So God asks Job, can you control the constellations? Can you do things with them? Pleiades, 440 light years away. Orion. There's a picture of Orion. If you're like me, you have a hard time seeing constellations. You can see his belt, his sword hanging off his belt and his body. And I don't have in the picture all of his arms and stuff like that. But there's the basic shape of Orion. The stars that make up Orion are anywhere from 243 to 1,359 light years away. The bear, or Arcturus, also contains what we call the Big Dipper. There's Big Dipper. Stars in that are from 58 to 124 light years away. How big is a light year? Nope. It's much bigger than that. A light year is how far light travels in a year. And light travels at 186,000 miles per second. Actually, a little bit faster, but that's rounding. 186,000 miles per second. From here to the sun is somewhere between 7 and 9 light minutes. The distance to the stars is measured in light years. God says, so Job, be able to do things with the constellations out there? They can move across the sky, shape them into shapes. God works on so much bigger scale than we do. God continues next topic, verses 34 to 38. It says, can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that a flood of water may cover you? Can you send forth lightning, that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the inward parts, or given understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Who can tilt the waterskins of the heavens when the dust runs into a mass, the clouds stick fast together? Yeah. Well, maybe stars are too big for you, Job. And you can't really explain the weather to me, but can you control the weather, Job? Can you make it rain when you want it to? Make it rain when the earth needs it. Control the clouds, control the lightning. Obviously not. We still can't do that. It's something that's beyond our ability. Even, with 4,000 more years of science and technology, we still can't do that, or even come close to it. When the weather's bad, deal with it. Get out of the way. Hide. God continues 39 through 41. And from this point on, God shifts away from the forces of nature and the cosmos to the animal kingdom. Verses 39 through 41. It says, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetites of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their thicket? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander around for lack of food? So, Job, can you provide the food for the lions and the ravens? For the predators and for the scavengers? Implying basically they ultimately receive their food from God. God's the one that gave them the instincts to get their food. All that Job can do, or any of us, from a lion is maybe run from it. You're not going to provide food for it, unless you're a zookeeper, in which case you still keep your distance from it. God goes on in verses 1 through 4. It says, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch, bringing forth their offspring, and are delivered of their young. Their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return to them. So, Job, do you know the childbearing cycle of the wild goats and the deer? Apparently, the ones that live in the part of the world where Job would have lived are very secretive, and even to this day, hardly anyone has seen them giving birth. They do go and hide when they give birth. It's been very rarely observed, even today. Continues verses 5 through 8. It says, who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I have given the arid plain for his home, and the salt land for his dwelling place. He scorns the tumult of the city. He hears not the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains as his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. It's Job. Who made the wild donkey free? Who let him be wild and go do whatever he wants and live in the wilderness and take care of himself? Apparently the animal he's talking about is most likely this guy here. It's called an onager. Lives out in the wilderness in the Middle East. And so God says, Job, who made him the way he is? I don't think it was you, Job. Continues, verses 9 through 12. And in the King James, what the animal here is translated as unicorn. It's not a unicorn. That's a mistranslation. So I'm sorry the Bible doesn't talk about unicorns. That was the King James translators didn't know what animal was talking about, so they made a guess. More recent grammatical studies show that it's in fact a wild ox. So verses 9 through 12, it says, is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind him in the furrow with ropes, or will he harrow the valleys for you? Will you depend on him because his strength is great, and will you leave to him your labor? Do you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? That says, Job, can you make the wild ox work for you? And the animal he's talking about is probably this guy here. It's called an auroch. It's not around anymore. That is not a real one. That's a reconstruction of what they probably looked like based on their skeletons. They haven't been around apparently for 700 or 800 years, at least. At least if Wikipedia is telling me the truth. But there's also a size comparison next to a person. So God says, so, Job, can you go up to these guys and just get them to plow your field for you? Now, obviously, mankind can tame and domesticate wild animals with years of training and crossbreeding and stuff like that. But you can't just walk up to him and attach a plow to him and expect anything good to happen. At best, he's going to run away with your plow. At best. But yet God can use wild animals as his tools. He can use them for whatever he wants. We have the example of the ravens feeding Elijah during a famine. Rather than taking the food for themselves, they bring it to him. We have the lions who leave Daniel alone when the king is trying to execute him. And as soon as Daniel's taken out and his enemies are thrown in, the lions eat them alive. We have the whale, or big fish, that swallows Jonah and barfs him out 3 days later. Because God wanted him to do that. God's in absolute control of everything, including wild animals and nature. And then God goes on to describe just several of his interesting animals that he's created, verses 13 through 18. This one's a little bit difficult. The Hebrew of it is very hard to translate in verse 13, so every translation reads a bit different, but best guess at verse 13. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. And then goes on to talk about the ostrich. It says, for she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them, and that the wild beast may trample them. She deals cruelly with her young, as if they were not hers, though her labor be in vain, yet she has no fear, because God has made her forget wisdom and given her no share in understanding. When she rouses herself to flee, she laughs at the horse and his rider. I says, Job, look at this funny thing I made. It's a bird. It has really beautiful feathers. I mean, in the past, ostrich feathers have been used for decoration. Big, beautiful feathers. It can't fly. You can't use them like a stork can. It barely takes care of its young. In fact, I looked up some facts about ostriches. Apparently, their nests, as God describes, are on the ground. And they take so poor care of their young that only 10% of nests last all the way through the period until the eggs hatch. And of those chicks that hatch, only 15% of them survive the first year. So, completely negligent mother. And yet, this weird bird that can't fly, barely takes care of its young, can outrun a horse. God's creative, and I think God has a sense of humor. I think some of the other animals, the duck-billed platypus. It's like a beaver duck thing with poisonous spurs on its feet. Giraffe. That ridiculous neck. Elephant with a long nose. Penguins, another bird that can't fly. They waddle around. They look really clumsy on land, but when they get in the water, boy, they swim better than some fish. God has a great amount of creativity and, like I said, humor in the things that he makes. He goes on, verses 19 through 25. And I lost my place. There we go. It says, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws in the valley and exults in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver and flashing spear and the javelin. With fierceness and rage he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. Then the trumpet sound, he says, aha! He smells the battle from afar, and the thunder of the captains and the shouting. When we think of horses, we don't generally think of them in these terms. But back in Job's day, they were used for battle. And they were not skittish, like maybe the ones that we've encountered. They were pretty nasty fighting machines. Here's a picture, obviously not from Job's day, but there's a picture of a nice cavalry charge from back when they still used horses. That says, Job, did you make the horse? Did you give him his strength? Did you give him his ferocity in battle? Obviously not. Verses 26 through 30. It says, is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the rocks he dwells and makes his home, on the rocky crag and stronghold. From there he spies out the prey, his eye behold it from afar. His young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there he is. Job, did you design the birds of prey? Here's the hawk. Job, did you design the hawk and teach it how to fly? Again, how recently has man been able to make flying machines? 100 years since tower flight, a little bit longer than that since balloon flight. Even now, we don't have our personal flying suits yet. That's still sci-fi. It's still in the future, if ever. Hey, our flying cars. And so God emphasized that their flight, their inaccessible nests, their great keen eyesight where they can spot tiny things on the ground. Their eyesight's way better than ours. The word he uses for eagle could also be referring to the vulture. It's the same general word in Hebrew. Job, did you design that too? And with that, God is kind of done with his first round of questions to Job. And he kind of comes to the point. He comes to the point of why he was asking Job these questions. Because, really these questions don't seem to have anything to do with what's been happening to Job. Job's question has been, why am I suffering? And God shows up and gives him a trivial quiz on the nature kingdom, for which he has no answers. Oh, by the way, there's an eagle. That's a golden eagle. You will find that kind in Palestine, so that might be the one we're talking about. Anyway, Job chapter 40, verse 1 and 2. It says, "And the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it." So God comes to the point of his questions. He is pointing out the foolishness of trying to find fault with him. The foolishness of Job thinking that if he could just talk to God, he could persuade God that God was treating him unfairly. The implication seems to be, if you think that you have enough wisdom to find fault with something as complex and deep as the justice of God, the righteousness of God, the will of God, God's dealings with mankind, then surely you have the knowledge to understand and control the physical universe like God does. And since you don't have the knowledge to understand and control the physical universe like God does, what makes you think that you have the wisdom to find fault with God? And Job understands. It's his answer in verses 3 through 5. It says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further." Job says, "I realize how small and insignificant I am next to the greatness and wisdom of God. If I can't even explain the physical universe, who am I to think that I can question his justice and righteousness and wisdom?" He says, "I'm going to just put my hand on my mouth and shut up. And I've already spoken a couple times, but I'm done with that. In the presence of God, I'm just going to keep quiet." One of the commentaries I read, I think, expressed it very well. So God's answer is not an explanation. It is himself. He wants Job to trust him because of who he is, not because Job understands or makes sense of everything that's happening with his tiny human intellect. As I said all the way at the start of this study, a lot of people say that the theme of Job is, why do the righteous suffer? I don't think that's right. Because God doesn't show up and give Job an explanation of why he's suffering. Better theme, how should the righteous deal with suffering? Because what God does do is show up and say, "Job, look at me. I am the great and powerful and good God. Why do you think that I'm doing something wrong? Job, trust me. Whether you understand or not, trust me. Because I'm God. And you're not." And Job at this point at least partially recognizes this. But God isn't done yet. He's got a few more chapters to go. But more on that next week. For this week, God wants the same thing from us that he wanted from Job. Go over to Hebrews chapter 11. What's Hebrews 11 about? Faith. Hebrews 11 is a faith chapter. It tells about all the heroes of the faith, mostly from the Old Testament. And the way that they showed their faith was to go and do what God asked them to do. Even though sometimes it seemed ridiculous. Noah, go build a boat. There's never been any such thing as rain, but go build a boat. Abraham, start walking that way, I'll tell you when to stop. Abraham, you've waited 100 years for your son, now go kill him. So forth. Part of that chapter, verse 6, says this: without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Amen. That's the point of the book of Job. Trust God. You might not understand what he's doing. It might seem absolutely horrible and unpleasant. It might cause you grief. And it's perfectly okay to express that grief to God. Let's read the Psalms. David certainly does. But what God wants from us is to trust him because of who he is. Because he is our great God. And he loves us. He has promised to work all things out for our good. Response to suffering is not to try and figure it all out. Now, certainly, the thoughts will pop into our mind and wonder why. But that's not what we're supposed to obsess over. The proper response to suffering is to trust our great and loving God. To realize that he knows what he's doing, whether it seems like it or not. All these people in Hebrews chapter 11, they're in that chapter because they trusted God enough to go and do something that seemed absolutely ridiculous. And for some of them, something miraculous happened on their behalf. Noah and his family were saved from the flood in the ark. Abraham became the father of the Jewish nation. Abraham was stopped from killing his son at the last moment and knew then that his faith was strong enough to do whatever God asked. Others of them, see Hebrews 11, verse 36. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. Wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Some of them didn't seem to have a happy ending in this lifetime. They still trusted God. They still did what God asked them to do. Whether it made sense or not, whether it seemed to be leading somewhere good for them or not, they obeyed him. Chapter of Hebrews 11 wraps up, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God has provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. And one day, all who faithfully serve God will receive the thing that is promised to them. Some of these people died without receiving it yet, and that's because we're all going to get it together. Our Lord and Savior returns. We talked about that this morning. When he returns and makes all things right, rewards the faithful, sets up his kingdom that will last forever. We have that to look forward to, and we can trust him that because he is good and righteous and all-powerful, even if it doesn't look like right now is good, he knows what he's doing. He is our great and awesome God. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you that we can put our trust in you. That you see the whole picture. That you have all things under your control. That even when we have no idea what you're doing, we can have the assurance that it's going to, in the end, be for our good. That we get to look forward to that day when you make all things new. And we get to live with you forever in absolute perfection. Help us to have that faith, not just when things are going well, but even more so when things are going poorly, when it doesn't look like what's happening is good. Help us to trust you. In Jesus' name, amen.